It is Wednesday, May 22nd, 2019. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through, so therefore we'll pass over some of them quickly but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing in some of the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. This month, I would like to highlight some of the key messages outlined in the materials posted at mattasi.com as part of our triannual update on regional developments. As such, I'd like to discuss the areas highlighted here. Starting with the Eurozone, the problem here is threefold: demographic, high state and fiscal interventionism, lack of technological leadership. If we add the political risk of some governments who want to penalize high productivity sectors while subsidizing those of low productivity, we have an economic challenge that will simply not be solved with liquidity injections and low rates. With rates at zero and almost 1.8 trillion euros of excess liquidity, the problem of the Euro Union is not the moderate global slowdown. It is perpetuating a rigid, intervened, and extractive model. The United States or the United Kingdom have buffers to face a slowdown. Most European countries are dangerously ignoring it, and even worse, proposing large government spending and high taxes as the solution. The European Union has completely abandoned its reform agenda to bet it all on the mirage of monetary policy, while economic, demographic, state, and political risks rise. Other than Germany, in the rest of the Eurozone, the fragility of the economies is linked to both fiscal imbalances and excess interventionism that make them more vulnerable to a change in the cycle. In France, the word crisis appears on the front page of newspapers and economic programs as a real possibility. The entire country is aware that the slowdown is severe, and tax reductions and measures to strengthen economic performance are announced. In the periphery, countries must be aware that they have exhausted their fiscal space and acknowledge their vulnerability to a modest change of cycle. The OECD index of leading indicators already shows a negative figure, and the leading indicators published by the Ministry of Economy also reflect more than 10 in negative territory. That's why the Eurozone should be prepared, because most countries do not have the capacity that others have to confront a slowdown. In the EU, we have a zombified economy. Despite the ECB's subsidy of the Eurozone banking system, it remains in a sleepwalking state similar to the non-financial, non-crony capitalist zombie economy. Gone are the heady days of investment banking. There is now a legacy of derivatives and regulator fines. Technology has made the overextended branch network, typical of European retail bank, a costly white elephant. The market for emptying bank buildings in the towns and villages throughout Europe must be dire, a source of under-provisioned losses. On top of this, the ECB's interest rate policy has led to lending margins becoming paper thin. We also have a negative deposit rate. A negative deposit rate of 0.4% at the ECB has led to negative wholesale money, that is the Euribor, market rates along the yield curve to at least 12 months. This has allowed French banks, for example, to fund Italian government bond positions, stripping out 33 basis points on a riskless one-year bond. It's the peak of collapsed lending margin, when even the harebrained can see the risk is greater than the reward, whatever the regulator says. The entire yield curve is considerably lower than the Italian risk implies it should be, given its existing debt obligations, with 10-year Italian government bonds yielding only 2.55%. That's less than equivalent U.S. Treasuries, the global risk-free standard. And finally, we have interest rate suppression. Government bond yields have been and remain considerably reduced through the ECB's interest rate suppression and its bond buying programs. The expansion of European government debt since the Lehman crisis has been 50% to 9.7 trillion. This expansion, representing 3.1 trillion euros, compares with the expansion of the Eurosystem's own balance sheet of 2.8 trillion euros since 2009. In other words, the expansion of the Eurozone government debt has been nearly matched by the ECB's monetary creation. Bond prices, such as that of the Italian 10-year debt yield 2.55%, are therefore meaningless in the market sense. This has not been much of an issue so long as asset prices are rising and the global economy is expanding, because monetary inflation will keep the fiat bubble expanding. It is when a credit crisis materializes that the trouble starts. The fiat bubble develops leaks and eventually implodes. The second looming EU financial crisis will highly likely start, in my opinion, in Italy versus previously in what they referred to at the time as the pigs. I have recently posted that the Italian crisis in turn has the earmarks of potentially being triggered by a Turkish crisis. It's ironic that the 2011-2012 EU banking crisis stemmed from Greece and Cyprus. Now we have Turkey as part of this three-country region of the world that bridges the EU with the Middle East. Italy's economy, as measured in real GDP, shrank for 2 quarters in a row, which puts it in a technical recession. There are worries from France. We read stark warnings from French Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire. To quote him, "Don't underestimate the impact of the Italian recession," end of quote. Le Maire also conceded that while contagion in the Eurozone was definitely contained, the Eurozone is not sufficiently armed to face a new economic or financial crisis. I'm quoting him there. The French government is now openly worried that such a crisis could begin in Italy. The economies of both Italy and France are tightly interwoven, with annual trade flows of around 90 trillion euros. More important still, French banks, by a long shot, the biggest owners of Italian public and private debt, with total holdings of 311 billion euros as of the third quarter of 2018, at least according to the Bank of International Settlements, is up 34 billion from the first quarter of 2018. French banks increased their holdings of Italian debt by over 10% in 2018, once again belying the ECB's long-held claim that its QE program would help reduce the level of interdependence between European sovereigns and banks. We have worries from the IMF on Italy. France isn't the only Eurozone nation with unhealthy levels of exposure to Italian debt, although it is far and away the most exposed. According to the Bank of International Settlements, German lenders have 87 billion euros worth of exposure to Italian debt, up from 79 billion just 6 months ago. And Spanish lenders have 75 billion euros in lending, up from 69 billion. If you include derivatives, guarantees, and credit commitments, German lenders are exposed to the tune of 126 billion euros, and Spanish lenders 89 billion. Taken together, the financial sectors of the largest, second largest, and fourth largest economies in the Eurozone, Germany, France, and Spain, hold no less than 600 billion euros of Italian debt, derivatives, credit commitments, and guarantees on their balance sheets. Italy's government is perfectly cognizant that French, German, and Spanish banks are now far too exposed to their Italian debt for their respective governments to even entertain the idea of pushing Italy to the edge. That knowledge is fueling the coalition government's bravado, with some lawmakers now even talking about nationalizing Italy's central bank, the Bank of Italy, for a total sum of 155,000 euros and taking control of its assets, including Italy's large pile of gold. The more the Commission tries to bring Rome in line, the wider the spreads on Italian bonds tend to grow, which in turn forces Italian banks to cut their lending. This risks deepening Italy's economic slowdown, which would put even further strains on Italy's fragile banking system, and that's the last thing that France's government or its banks really want. I also note that Italy is the first founding EU member and the first G7 nation to officially sign on to Beijing's One Belt, One Road economic development initiative. Though Italy is directly defying Washington's warnings about the national security threat endemic to doing business with Chinese state-backed companies, with Italy's economy mired in a recession and the outlook for growth dim, Beijing has offered Rome's ruling populace something that Brussels and the West haven't even been willing or able to offer: an unprecedented economic boon. France, The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, released its annual revenue statistics report this week, and France topped the charts with a tax take over 46% of GDP in 2017. That's more than Denmark at 46%, Sweden at 44%, Germany at 37.5%, and far more than the OECD average of 34%, or the U.S. at 27%, which includes that number includes all levels of government. France doesn't collect that revenue in the ways you might think. Despite the stereotype of heavy European income taxes on the rich, Paris relies disproportionately on social insurance, payroll, and property taxes. Social taxes account for 37% of French revenue. The OECD average is 26%. Payroll and property taxes contribute 3% and 9% compared to OECD's average of 1% and 6%. The payroll tax is very regressive. It consumes a larger share of low and middle-class earners than rich people. Then Europe adds a regressive consumption tax, the value-added tax, or VAT. In France, VAT and other consumption taxes make up 24% of revenue, and that's on the low side compared to the OECD average of 33%. Consumption taxes often fall hardest on the poor and middle class, who devote a greater proportion of their income to consumption. Add one more increase to an already high and regressive gas tax in France to the existing 214 taxes and duties, and you guessed it, the people went nuts. In the UK, Prime Minister Theresa May has simply been clinging on to some semblance of control over the manner and timing of her departure. Shown here is the letter out last week confirming that a resignation date will be announced within a very few short weeks and is based on the condition of the Prime Minister bringing her widely hated Brexit withdrawal plan back for an unprecedented fourth vote in the Commons. She is in talks with the Labour Party to try and convince the opposition to abstain from the vote, which would increase the odds of the agreement passing. Good luck with that. It is looking more and more like Brexit with no agreement, or an election that will be fundamentally about getting the electorate to vote, since powers to be believe they got it wrong the first time. In the U.S., we have had more than 2 years of the media and swamp not accepting the people's choice of Trump. In the UK, it was the Brexit vote. In both cases, it has been obvious that democracy is no longer working the way it used to at least appear to be previously. Finally, in Germany, on a closing note on the EU, we are now witnessing major issues in Germany. Two pillars of the EU, Germany and France, have both had their leaders basically ejected. Macron has lost all real political power based on his handling of the Yellow Jacket riots, and Angela Merkel is a leader in name only, as managing her narrow coalition has usurped her former leadership powers on the EU's main stage. Germany is quickly becoming a diminishing giant, and that spells trouble for Europe. Slower Chinese growth and the woes of Germany's auto industry are sending the economy into a recession. Germany's near recession in the second half of 2018 was a surprise to many. It should not have been. World trade growth slowed starting early 2018, just when Germany's auto industry was dealing with a wrenching drop in domestic sales. This concurrent hit to two of Germany's vulnerabilities, overwhelming dependence on buoyant world trade and accelerating obsolescence of its industrial structure, is pushing the economy into recession. Absent a heroic policy effort, a protracted German slowdown will curb European growth. It could fuel further rise in nationalism, which would deliver another blow to the vision of a united Europe. Germany's fabled manufacturers have reinvented themselves in past decades, but always within the same framework of engineering excellence, supported by an enviable apprenticeship system that produced generations of highly industrialized, literate factory workers. However, today the global technology race is in science and mathematics-based electronic and computing technologies, which Germany is proving and also ran. Among the world's top 15 science and mathematics university programs, East Asian economies, China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, take prize spots along with the United States. No Germany or European universities make that prestigious list. Germany could easily fall into the world's second-tier economic league unless the country's leaders act with new urgency. Germany is another example of a great economic power fearful of giving up a celebrated past and hence is trapped in the present. The political powerful car industry is lobbying to hold back change. Helpfully, Chancellor Angela Merkel has argued against higher emission limits. For her, too rapid a shift could hugely disrupt the networks of production that generate wealth. Merkel feels the ire of aging Germans, hurt most severely by the continuing industrial attrition. Such older Germans are at the leading edge of the country's increasing social and political tensions. The social trauma of this economic transition is eroding public support for Germany's mainstream political parties. As new contenders vie for influence, the political system is fragmenting, threatening Germany's vaunted political stability. However, gradual obsolescence of Germany's old industrial structure will weigh heavily on German growth, which will depress Europe's already low long-term growth potential. The continuing rise in German political entropy will highly likely further erode the country's grudging financial support of Europe. China's NPC-CPPCC report suggests China has big problems. China's manufacturing PMI is below 50, so is Japan, so is South Korea's, so is the Eurozone's, so is Australia's services PMI, and Taiwan's new export orders PMI subindex suggests the US ISM is going to head below 50 also. That is called a synchronized global manufacturing downturn. Against that background, we have just seen what the alphabet spaghetti of China's NPC and CPPCC have produced so far. The main headline is this: China sets 2019 GDP growth target at 6 to 6.5%. Wow, which sounds reassuring. Yet Chinese GDP growth is not a measure of what the economy actually does, but of how many empty apartments they are prepared to add to their inventory pile of 65 million apartments. The details of what 2019 will apparently also promise looks equally good on the surface, very much the opposite underneath. CPI growth of 3%. How? With deflation looming? 11 million urban jobs to be created when there are reports of a softer labor market? M2 growth will be the same as nominal GDP growth, which implies around 9%. Are FX reserves going to rise to 9% too? I don't think so. China's manipulated data will not save the macro outlook. Xi Jinping had to beat expectations with a crowd pleaser in the first quarter. The number was duly produced, 6.4%. Could it really be true? Of course it's not true. Japan's manufacturing exports to China fell 9.4% in March, year on year. Singapore's shipments dropped 8.7% to China, 22% to Indonesia, 27% to Taiwan were the drops. Korea's exports are down 8.2%. A paper last month for the Brookings Institute, which was called A Forensic Examination of China's National Accounts, concluded that the GDP growth has been overstated by 1.9% a year on average since 2006. They use satellite data to track nightlights in manufacturing zones, railway cargo volume, and so forth. Bear in mind that if China's economy is a fifth or a quarter smaller than claimed, it implies that the total debt ratio is not 300% of GDP, but closer to 400%. If China's growth rate is 1.7% lower and falling every year, the country is less able to rely on nominal GDP expansion, whittling away the liabilities. Debt dynamics take an ugly turn, just at a time when the working age population is contracting by 2 million a year. The International Monetary Fund says China needs true growth of 5% to prevent a rising ratio of bad loans in the banking system. Beijing has opened its fiscal floodgates to some degree over the recent weeks. Broad credit grew by $439 billion in March alone. Business cuts were another $300 billion. Bond issuance by local governments was pulled forward for extra impact. But once you strip out the offsets, it's far from clear that the picture for 2019 has changed, nor is it clear what can be achieved with more credit. The IMF said in its fiscal monitor that the country now needs 4.1 yuan of extra credit to generate 1 yuan of GDP growth compared to 3.5 in 2015 and only 2.5 in 2009. The credit intensity ratio has worsened dramatically. I stick to my view that the U.S. will slump to stall speed before China recovers. Europe is on the thinnest of ice. It has a broken banking system. It is chronically incapable of generating its own internal growth or taking meaningful measures in self-defense. Momentum has fizzled out in all three blocks of the international system. We are entering the window of maximum vulnerability. We have zombie corporations, 440 Chinese companies, that issued profit warnings in 1 day. Beijing continues its relentless crackdown of shadow banking as the government is no longer backstopping every corporation, which has become a collective concern among market participants. Companies cited the country's economic slowdown, which is also catalyzing sales of Chinese-held U.S. real estate, as well as recent accounting changes that followed a $2.3 trillion equity market sell-off last year. Out of the more than 2,400 mainland-listed companies, 373 have said they are going to post a loss. And what's more concerning, 86% of those companies were profitable in 2017. Private companies are particularly vulnerable to the economic slowdown. The deleveraging campaign and the deterioration of their corporate health is normal for any economy that is shifting gears and slowing down. One reason why China's companies are suddenly coming clean was that companies whose shares are already quite battered have nothing to lose by lowering earnings forecasts or taking large impairments for 2018. Many of these companies are actually taking a bath to begin anew in 2019. We have de-dollarization. China is dumping U.S. treasuries at the fastest pace in 2 years. In March, China sold $2.5 billion in U.S. treasuries in March. Other than a minor positive in February, China has sold U.S. treasuries every month since September of 2018. Remember, China is the largest foreign owner of U.S. treasuries at $1.1 trillion. Let's switch to Japan. The Bank of Japan is now the top 10 shareholder in 50% of the Nikkei. Japan's central bank is quietly nationalizing its entire market. The BOJ has gone from being a top 10 holder in 40% Japanese stocks last March to 50% just 1 year later. The Bank of Japan is now a top 10 shareholder in 50% of all Japanese companies. Bank of Japan now owns a stunning 75% of all Japanese ETFs. As of March 2018, the Japanese central bank had become a major shareholder in nearly 40% of all listed companies. This, of course, is in addition to the Bank of Japan's trillions in Japanese JGB holdings, which at last check was over 100% of GDP and 43% of all outstanding bonds. The BOJ also became the top shareholder in 23 companies, including Nidec, Fanuc, Omron through the ETF holdings, but as of Q1, it was among the top 10 holders of 49.7% of all Tokyo-listed enterprises. The BOJ is ushering in a new age for the Japanese market, the age of creeping nationalism, where a monetary authority is becoming the biggest owner of corporate assets using money printed out of thin air to fund the purchases. The bank's ETF program is eroding market discipline as companies are rewarded simply for being in major market indexes rather than for having new business strategies or offering more dividends. This is what the OECD said in a country survey published recently, citing a previous Nikkei report. If the Nikkei stock average falls below 18,000, the market value of ETF holdings will fall below their book value. End of quote. The QE party is steadily ending, while the Bank of Japan attempts mixed signals. In 2019, markets are facing a situation for the first time in a decade where the big three QEers, the Fed, the BOJ, and the ECB, will on net whittle down ever so slowly the assets on their combined balance sheets, with the BOJ continuing to add a smidgen. The QE taper is well underway, despite whatever the Bank of Japan may proclaim to keep everyone guessing. With the ECB maintaining what it has, the Fed has already reduced its balance sheet by over $400 billion since the start of QE unwind in October 2017, and for now continues to run its QE unwind on automatic pilot. With the Fed continuing to roll off, the ECB tapering its massive QE to zero as of December 2018 and is currently only planning to replace securities when they mature to keep its balance sheet roughly level. QQE started in December 2012 as part of Abenomics. During peak QQE, in the 12-month period ending December 31st, 2016, the BOJ assets ballooned to 93 trillion yen. Over the most recent 12-month period ending January 31st, 2019, the BOJ added 30 trillion yen to its balance sheet, the smallest such gain since March 2013. The switch from regular QQE to the 2 steps forward, 1 step back QQE came without any announcements from the BOJ, which continues to say that QQE with yield curve control. The BOJ is targeting the entire yield curve, not just short-term yields, will be maintained for as long as needed to achieve 2% inflation. Clearly, the QQE taper is well underway, despite whatever the BOJ may proclaim to keep everyone guessing. Another week, another leg of emerging market rout. It has been a steady decline, which has recently began to reaccelerate. An MSCI gauge of developing nation stocks slipped 3.7%, setting the stage for the worst month since October. It was even worse for currencies, which capped a 5th straight week of declines, erasing gains for the year. The direction of emerging market equities is hanging in the balance of the global risk environment and likely depend on U.S.-China talks, at least in the short term. We continue to see the near-term risk for emerging markets as tilted to the downside, and the risk of additional tariffs being implemented is rising. Comments from China's state media suggest that the chances of further negotiations with the U.S. over trade issues are unlikely in the near term. There is more volatility to come. There aren't a whole lot of things that can support emerging markets right now. The back and forth of trade negotiations between the U.S. and China continues to be the main guide for markets as investors reassess the odds of a deal between the world's 2 largest economies. The tone of the talks, which had seemingly improved last week, soured again over the last few days, while the White House barred companies deemed a national security threat from selling to the U.S. On Friday, China's state media signaled a lack of interest in resuming trade talks with the U.S. Investors have not turned significantly more bearish because most believe that the latest escalation in trade war tensions between the U.S. and China is merely a negotiating tactic to extract concessions ahead of a deal. From a situational analysis, we have really 3 things that are pretty critical. The U.S.-China trade tensions, the EU disintegration has begun, and failed governance and diplomacy. First of all, it now looks like the trade war talks were not in reality constructive. We see Trump demand China put commitments into law. China replied that no one should expect China to swallow bitter fruit that harms its core interest, unquote. Trump ordered Litzheiser to begin the process of imposing tariffs on all remaining exports from China. This would impact an additional $300 billion worth of goods. China said it would retaliate. Then Trump warned China not to retaliate or it would face worse terms. Trump tweeted, "Love collecting big tariffs." Kudlow said on Sunday he expected retaliatory tariffs to kick in, but it had not happened yet. China warned Trump on Sunday not to underestimate China's endurance and that China is not afraid to fight. China posted its own set of demands for further talking, including the removal of all extra tariffs. China's demands now are threefold: the complete removal of all trade-related tariffs. The U.S. must set targets for Chinese purchases of goods in line with real demand. And 3, ensure that the text of the deal is balanced to ensure the dignity of both nations. The China's People Daily reported that the U.S. should take full responsibility for trade talk setbacks because it raised tariffs on China's products. Their state television reported China sought a mutual beneficial agreement, but the U.S. went back on its word. At least that's what the state broadcaster reported. According to people close to the talks, as the sides march toward a deal that they hoped initially to close last week, they have gotten stuck in recent weeks on the question of lifting U.S. tariffs in response to Chinese steps to address American complaints. When the U.S. insisted that it would leave tariffs in place, the Chinese threatened to blow up the discussions, and they have. Now, Trump has essentially taken a sledgehammer to Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei. When the Commerce Department put Huawei On the entity list, it essentially banned the company from buying much-needed parts and components from U.S. firms. Some have described this as a nuclear option. I think that description is quite accurate. In the end, this move is going to be absolutely devastating if sustained for Huawei. Of course, the Chinese are absolutely furious about this. Huawei is viewed with great national pride in China, and this move is considered to be a direct insult to Chinese national honor. Most Americans are not paying too much attention to the details of the trade war, but in China, this is a really big deal, and people are extremely angry. In fact, there has apparently been a run on Donald Trump toilet brushes in China in recent days because the Chinese are so angry. China has been lying, cheating, stealing our technology, and robbing us blind. And our technology leaders have been begging for our politicians to stand up and do something. When Trump started talking tough about China, it was evidence that someone actually really understood the overall issues. But I also want everyone to understand that trying to decouple from the Chinese economy would be extremely painful, even in the most optimistic scenario. Our two economies have become inextricably integrated, and we have become very dependent on Chinese in many different ways. China buys our soybeans, they provide us with rare earth elements, and they own more than $1 trillion of our debt. When negotiating with China, you need to be tough, but also need a lot of finesse. Taking a baseball bat and slamming it into their kneecaps is not going to work. If we destroy our relationship with China, that is going to result in us going down a very dark path. Yes, China is an evil empire that has no respect for human rights at all. There is no freedom of speech in China. Over the past year, they have been shutting down lots of churches and burning lots of Bibles, and they have been systematically throwing members of other religious minorities into concentration camps. So I don't have any sympathy for the Communist Chinese Party or government at all. I just want everybody to understand that they are a very dangerous adversary, and a protracted trade war could be truly disastrous for the entire global economy. As Germany and France comes apart, so too will the EU. We are forced to conclude that the fractures in France, Germany, and EU are widening by the day. The central problem is a flawed organizational structure. No effective military force, no control of their own borders, no control of their currency and banks, a government with a diverse population in which the majority either have no loyalty to Berlin or has dropped its loyalty, and which is also losing the alliance of many Eastern European immigrants in Germany. These people are among the most energized opponents of the refugee influx. Fast rising anarchy and lawlessness by the recent refugee immigrants, and which is well known to the population, as are the official orders to the police to minimize crime statistics reported by not opening official cases. The continuing spiral of the ruling post-World War II political parties into their own political black holes, CDU, CSU on the right, and the SDP on the left, have all lost their hold on the modern German population. The EU disintegration has begun under the pressures of an EU recession and global slowdown and Brexit. EU now faces a recession now that the global economy has stopped expanding and is on the brink of a recession. Under these changing conditions, the monetary, systemic, and economic dangers facing the Eurozone are rapidly rising. EU disintegration has begun. There can be no doubt the ECB has so far only managed to prevent a financial and systemic crisis materializing because of the background of worldwide monetary and credit expansion inflating financial assets. Italy's the linchpin. It takes little imagination to realize that in an environment of rising bond yields and failing asset values, the Italian government and its economy will be exposed to intractable difficulties. And Brexit. Today, the EU is threatened with Brexit, which is yet to be resolved. It is becoming increasingly obvious to independent observers that the EU supranational socializing model is failing structurally, politically, economically, and financially. The next credit crisis, which appears to be evolving from the seeds of today's events, looks set to end the European dream. Governance and diplomacy is failing all around us. Confrontational tones are becoming the norm versus the exception. The number of global tensions are escalating. Broad-based military buildups are occurring. The World Economic Forum at this year's Davos meeting cited nationalism as one of the biggest threats to global stability. The World Economic Forum is worried that the world won't be able to nimbly cooperate and respond to threats if something isn't done about the increasingly state-centric politics, that is, growing populism and nationalism. To quote them in their annual Global Risk Report presented at Davos in January, quote, "Is the world sleepwalking into a crisis? Global risks are intensifying, but the collective will to tackle them appears to be lacking. Instead, divisions are hardening. The world is moving into a new phase of strongly state-centered politics, noted in last year's Global Risk Reports, which continued throughout 2018. The idea of taking back control, whether domestically from political rivals or externally from multilateral or supranational organizations, resonates across many countries and many issues. The energy now expended on consolidating or recovering national control risk weakening collective responses to emerging global challenges. We are drifting deeper into global problems from which we struggle to extract ourselves." End of quote. If another global crisis were to hit, would the necessary levels of cooperation and support be forthcoming? Probably, but the tension between the globalization of the world's economy and the growing nationalization of world politics is a deepening risk. In searching for something, anything to blame for the rise of populism, that is, aside from policy decisions dictated by increasingly out-of-touch elites, in my opinion, the drivers behind much of the growth in populism, nationalism, mass migrations, and much of the social unrest is inequality, recently made much worse by failed monetary policies to stem the end of the debt supercycle. So, in closing, as I always remind you, remember, the answer will be to print more money. It is the only answer politicians of all countries will ever agree on. Until that is, no one wants it or trusts it. Invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires a careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2019 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I thank you sincerely for listening.